Welcome back to Tasteland, hosted by myself, Francis Zier, and Daisy Aliotto. We also have a guest joining us shortly, David Rudnick. Daisy, who is David?
Well, I thought I was going to get to say my own name, but that's fine.
No, not today.
David Rudnick is a graphic designer who's been working for over a decade with musicians like, you say Avian Christ? Or Evian?
Evian?
Evian Christ?
I don't really know. I just drink the water.
Right. Oh, I'm sure. And Black Midi. He's worked with artists like Daniel Arnold. He's made typefaces for Arsenal, Boo. And some of the most compelling on-chain NFT work, which, that might be mutually exclusive for some of you. But we could get into what he sees in the blockchain, because I agree the way that he used it was very innovative and cool. We also have an announcement from this podcast.
Very big announcement.
Very big announcement, which is we're raising money for the National Writers Union Service Organization, which is a nonprofit arm within the union, raising a legal fund to defend media freelancers from non-payment and other grievances. And we're doing that with a ticketed live recording of the podcast. The episode will be focused on worker-owned media collectives. We have 3 amazing guests. Samantha Cole from 404 Media, Max Rivlin-Nadler from Hellgate, and Jasper Wang from Defector. And that'll take place on Saturday, November 16th at 7 p.m., doors at 6:30. And that'll be at 25 Broadway in New York at the National Writers Union offices, which are right behind the Wall Street Bowl. You cannot miss them.
Bowl. Famous icon of writing, the Wall Street Bowl.
Yeah, so we're very excited to dip a toe in events for a cause. It's a cause that I care deeply about, getting freelancers paid. The NWU has been defending freelancers in court for years. They've successfully won, millions of dollars in money that's owed to writers. And so, we're all in.
I also think, apropos of that Future of Journalism article in New York Magazine that we talked about last week, I think this is more than, whatever. I enjoyed reading that article, but I think a more interesting future of journalism idea is this kind of these worker-owned collective outlets, like all three of the ones that from people we're talking to. There's the other one that just came out last week, Hearing Things. So I'm really excited to talk to some of the people who are actually at the forefront of the future of media.
Absolutely. I briefly considered gathering a 57-person rebuttal in dirt before realizing
they can buy tickets.
We don't quite have the editorial bandwidth right now to clap back.
Your staff is
well, excuse you. But if I did gather 57 people that I think actually have an on the ground point of view on the future of media, these 3 people would definitely be on the list.
Absolutely.
So consider this a miniature alternative to that cover story.
Buy a ticket. It's for a good cause. We'll have the link in the episode description.
And if if you're not in New York, you can still donate on the ticket page, $1, $5, whatever you want. It all goes towards this legal fund.
Yes. Okay. Also talking about media for a second before David gets here. So the big story yesterday, right, was about the Washington Post deciding to kill their half-century practice of endorsing political candidates. Obviously, Jeff Bezos does a lot of business, a lot of government contracts. This, reports are that they've lost like at least 200,000 subscribers. That's a lot of revenue, etc.
8% of
8%, which is huge.
Outrageous. I've always wondered how much of a dent these boycott calls actually make. This is the biggest that I have ever heard of.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to talk about though, so Jacob O'Donnelly, who runs a media operator, argued that it's a good, if poorly timed move, and that more news outlets should be practicing this kind of journalistic impartiality as a civic duty, which let's entertain that for a second.
I have something to say.
Oh, okay. Well, you say it, then I'll say my thing.
I think if you work in the media business, a good move can never be poorly timed, because if it's poorly timed and poorly communicated, it's not a good move. Right?
Go.
You work in an industry where the medium is the message, and a much, much stronger execution of this move that is more plausibly uncompromised would have been to announce this midway through the previous administration, when nobody's really even talking about the next election yet, who the candidates will be. it shows a huge lack of discipline and a failure of communication and a breakdown in the communication chain for there to be an op-ed that existed and was written before it was killed, which is my understanding is like, it was written. So yeah, I'm sorry. I like read part of Jeff Bezos. So I read the piece of it that crossed my timeline. Jeff Bezos is, I mean, I saw people in the tech community who don't believe that media should be political, don't believe that op-ed pages should be making endorsements, praising his, you know, what he wrote, his op-ed. I saw a lot of journalists saying like, why is he using we as if he's like part of this journalism community? So I saw both sides on my timeline.
Well, I think, I mean, personally, I believe that like, I don't know. I think neutrality is kind of like a equilibrium that you can never really hit. I don't know if it really exists, but I did, one thing that was compelling to me about this in Jacob O'Donnelly's thing that I read earlier was like, so, you know, when I talk to like creator journalists all the time, they are so opinions based and like they don't have like a newsroom backing them up and like fact checkers, editors. So like they're inherently always going to be more partial, less impartial. And these people often say that too. Like that's part of why they like being independent is they get to put themselves into it and do whatever they want. And like, you know, that's the appeal. So I don't know. I was wondering if like maybe that's one direction of the future of media is like opinion writing is kind of just the realm of these more indie journalists, indie creators, and then maybe like newspaper, you know, more legacy publications, bigger organizations do have to become more like, you know, try to affect an impartiality, and that they'll always have the opinion, you know, reporting, I'm sure, but I hadn't considered that as like a potential evolution before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all cap. Like, you know, free press has come up, and
Bezos is capping. That's for sure.
Well, we brought free press up on this before, and you know, they've gotten a lot of funding from people who are also like venture capital investors who, you know, believe that the media shouldn't be political. But I think their definition of neutrality still contains an ideology. And so, yeah, like when neutrality itself is an ideology, and I would say it's right of center, where the center of,
yeah, for sure,
you know, not like the electoral college, but like what's actually popular in America right now. Like it's hard to say that that's like a vacuum of ideology.
Is, you know, not voting is voting, etc.
Yeah, you're right. Like every action or inaction contains a statement of values. And yeah, I'm just not buying that this timing was
accidental.
Yeah, I mean, because why do it this way?
Yeah, it's an underline. I for one can't wait for this election to be over, and then we can stop talking and then we can talk about it again in 4 years.
So you can go back to brunch, Francis.
So yeah, you know, so I can go back to brunch. I don't really do brunch, honestly.
Okay, thanks for letting us know. I'm going to tell you about a book I've been reading.
Oh yeah. Please.
So because this came up on the last podcast with Eliza, we were talking about how a lot of praised literary fiction sells 5,000 copies. And, you know, if it's not like a bestseller, then you could expect that maybe it's 5,000. That debut novels, like if they sell 1,000, that's considered good. And, you know, she was telling us sort of the range of copies that they've sold of Cake Scene in print, because we were talking about print in 2024, which far exceeds like these debut novels that have like a lot of effort. You know, books take 1 year to 2 years to write. Obviously, they're putting together their issues in like a shorter amount of time. There's an editorial team behind it. There's a publisher behind it. I think that contrast is really interesting because we don't often force books and magazines into conversation like that, but I think that we should more. And in the past, it was just like, well, it's not the same market. Like the people who are buying Vogue aren't buying Sally Rooney. And now it's like, well, actually, I think we're kind of talking about the same people, and it's kind of a small influential group of people. So maybe we should force these things into conversation.
Wait, also, David is here.
Okay. Anyway, long story short, I'm reading a book called Negative Space. It was put out by an indie publisher. It sold 30,000 copies. It's not something that I would typically read, but I wanted to see what all the fuss is about. So maybe once I'm finished with the book, we can pick it up on the next episode.
Okay, yeah. Let's talk about it next week.
All right.
Let's let him in. Hello, David.
Hi. Hello, guys. How you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
He's already laughing. Podcasting is inherently funny, so that's the correct response to coming in here with us.
Welcome to Tasteland.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So you are calling, I believe, from Ghent in Belgium, so I've been following you for a little while. I've always wondered why you live in Ghent. Not a town I'd ever thought of, really, until I knew that you lived there.
It's true. I am calling from Ghent in Belgium, and I am based here. I live here. I moved here close to 6 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in London, and I spent most of my 20s back and forth between the US and the UK because I went to college in America. And the reason I moved to Ghent is I reached a point when I was finishing up my MFA in graphic design, and I'd had the chance the year before I went to do the MFA to work out of a space in London that I'd reached a point where I was desperate for a studio, and I'd kind of talked to a property developer and managed to convince them that to let me do one of those like kind of caretaker things where they had a builder's merchants that was kind of abandoned, that they were going to flip and turn into some majestic gentrification opportunity in
beautiful lofts,
a blank coffee shop.
Well, but in the meantime, they were kind of like going through all the motions of what it would mean to do it. So they had this site on Dalston Lane, and I managed to convince them to let me have it basically. They were like, we'll sign this deal with you. You have to sign a piece of paper that basically says we can get you out at 10 days notice, kind of thing. If we sell this building, you're gone, kind of thing. I ended up being able to work out of there for the whole year. I basically got the keys on the 1st of January, and the last night was a New Year's Eve party. We kind of just like
a blowout
and gone. And I managed to get onto the MFA that year. I reapplied in the September and got onto the MFA program. And so kind of going into 2014, I knew I would be starting the program. And I felt like I spent those 2 years really looking hard, but I came to this conclusion. It was like, you want to buy somewhere because you want to turn it into a studio and you want to live there. I looked, and I was like, and you will never be able to do this in London. You will never be able to afford a space that you could buy. I had been like putting money aside from the practice, and I had like a small but not inconsiderable amount of money. I think I had like 120, 150,000 like saved up, and then I was like, maybe with a mortgage that could stretch to like 250,
solid down payment. Yeah.
And it was still like the options in London were just never going to, like, I'd had to be so far out. And also like, I wasn't like, this wasn't like, we'll buy smart, get on the property ladder, and then in a few years get it. Like, I was like, no, I want to like go.
And you want the space to be comfortable and inspiring too, right?
I wanted space. I was like, I'd been very spoiled by living in, like kind of a warehouse, but it was like mentally to have room to work and to feel like you could put things on the walls and stuff was really, that was transformative for my practice. If it hadn't been transformative, I wouldn't be putting a premium on it, but it was. So I basically reached a point where it was like, well, if you're not going to be in London, would you move to America? Because you've been to college here. You've got
in New Haven. We call it the Ghent of Connecticut.
That's in some ways that's an apt nickname. But I guess they're equally remote in some respects. But I also I had a very open set of criteria, but it was like, you need to be able to find a property you can afford, first thing. So it needs to be a city where the property values aren't insane. You ideally need to be able to legally move there, which is, like...
Was pre-Brexit?
Sorry?
Was it pre-Brexit?
So 2016. So it's like we're coming up to the Brexit vote, and I'm starting to look. I looked at a lot of cities. I started looking at Belgium really seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So like, well, you could take the Eurostar, you could take the train to Paris, you can go to Amsterdam, you can get to Germany easily. And the downside is, what's Belgium like? Everyone when I say move to Belgium, I see like 90% of their faces drop or do that weird thing where they're like, oh, cool. But it's like, okay, you've either like been to Brussels and hated it, which is totally fair because I don't love Brussels, or you're assuming with some degree of validity that Belgium's just some insane cultural backwater that no one would move to. But the thing about Belgium, and specifically Ghent and Flanders, but Ghent more than anything, because I looked at Antwerp and it still felt like, okay, the only reason I'm going into this depth about this is because I feel like some of your listeners might be going through a similar weird thing. I think a lot of my generation we thought, where they're just like, the metropolis doesn't work anymore. What is my future in this city where the compromises seem to outweigh the benefits? But everyone is here. So we're all in this together so that no one leaves.
I'm definitely going through this living in New York. I'm 30, we're getting to the age, like friends, we've been here for a while, where it's like, well, like, where do we go? I've got German citizenship as well. So I'm like, oh, well, maybe Berlin, but then it's kind of what you're saying. You're chasing the wave of gentrification and pricing out and et cetera. So Ghent basically is like where that wave, that tide doesn't exist so much. Gentrification isn't so much a thing.
Gentrification is real, unfortunately. I feel like I got in a little. I can, if you want to be the
Are you
worst,
saying gentrification or gentrification?
I did say gentrification.
Okay.
Yeah. This is the most boring topic ever, so I promise I'll move off it. But like the thing about what I'd say, like tertiary cities.
Mm-hmm.
Tertiary cities, like there's metropolises, and I think they are done, and they're kind of like a death trap in some ways. And it's like, unless you are tapped in already to the lifeblood of what makes that metropolis a first city, like you have a job at like in a premium cultural institution or something, unless you have that connection, I think like kind of like trying to enter that from the margins or from zero, you have to build your entire life around that. All your friends are going to have to be, you're going to have to network in that direction. You're going to have to build a personality that's amenable to it. You're going to have to want to interface with what the first city like needs to extract. And for a lot of people, I feel like, definitely for me, I was like, I'm not interested in doing that. I don't want to be part of, like, if I was going to make it as a graphic designer in London, I'd have to be inside some kind of like culture network that was interested in or closely affiliated. All these things I'm not interested in. Second cities are like cities that aspire to be primary cities. Like, well, kind of.
Wait, so I did re-listen to your Strelka talk last night, and there's a few talking points I pulled out, but one I think is really relevant here. So you talked about how like you're talking about like a chef's table and like the chef model and like the chef as designer type of thing, and how design companies are like, they're not training young designers to be great designers, to be leaders. There's too many designers, especially like in these kind of primary cities, like you're saying. So they're training them just to be labor, just to be kind of workers who will never aspire to that great leadership position. And then you kind of espouse this like small, sustainable local studio model, which is what you've done. You've got Terrain now, which I think you started like 5 years ago or so, maybe more. I don't know. But I don't know. I really like agree with you that like smaller, more sustainable businesses, many of those are just better for society, for people, than like the few massive design companies. And it's been successful for you, but I don't know. Do you see this model like proliferating more, or are you kind of a unicorn with Terrain? Like
I don't want to be a unicorn. And I think like kind of one of the things which I personally feel like I need to do a bit better at with the practice, because it's year 6.
Yeah.
And I'm still renovating the space that I bought. I'm not talking to you from the house that I bought. I'm talking to the place that we work, which is this beautiful space that I'm very, very happy that that we work from. It's one of the reasons why I guess we're not rushing on the one that I bought.
Yeah. Beautiful church in the background. I mean, come on.
Yeah, like a lovely view of the, kind of see all the spires of Ghent and stuff.
Amazing.
So it's very nice here. We weren't going to have this view at the studio, but I've been really obstinate about saying that one of the things that when we've talked about like what I want terrain, how terrain can help, how it can be useful to other designers, I think like one of the things which I was, again, a bit obstinate about was for our web presence, I don't want us to be a studio that just puts its portfolio online and just shows you the client list we have or the work.
Yeah, you're actually a little bit mysterious on the website.
It's quite spare.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain clients, like Francis follows football closely. I follow it in and out, more around big world events. Although my husband is a Spurs fan, which I'm sure you have strong opinions about. Yeah, well, me too.
My heart goes out to him. I hope he.
But we knew about the Arsenal thing, but I didn't see it on the site. Maybe I know, but he's
following you on Twitter, right?
Yeah, but so it's not foregrounding every single client, every single project.
It's not website, any of them. We have none on the. We have no.
It's the logo and like a crosshair,
logo and a contact link.
Maybe I just went to your website. Maybe where you have like Earth and Tombs.
Well, yeah. What is the difference between David Rudnick and Terrain? Like,
yeah, what is the difference between David Rudnick?
Honestly, like David Rudnick as a practicing entity kind of doesn't exist anymore. The archive of work is there because I know that there's still some interest in the stuff that I've done, and I'm also very aware that Terrain we do not show the work yet that we do
yet.
To say, yeah, I'm not like a studio should be secret and not show its work. I just wanted to do one really specific thing. I made this commitment to go here and build this building. I want Terrain's website to present Terrain and I want people when they hear that word Terrain to think of a space, not a company, not a kind of commercial entity. Yes, we are those things, but it's exactly like if I say the name of a restaurant.
Why a space and not a system of values? Because a studio has to be physical?
No, I think that the values will be evident in the work, but I think that what's missing in the world right now and what's missing, I think, in what they're entitled to hope for design is this idea that outside of some mythical lab that Apple have or some like deep bowels of again, like a handful of companies in the world, no one believes design happens anymore. It's like something that takes place on a laptop. But the conversation...
Or like snarkitecture.
Yeah. But or like Eliasson's like kind of like compound with 300 dudes in it or whatever.
Johnny Ives.
Yeah. Or Johnny's company, Love From. But, and they may get some star architect to do it, but it's also this palatial display of opulence where it's like billions of dollars in capital built this. And they, like Apple with their, with the giant,
the circle building.
Yeah. It's also this, like, that's a fortress. That's an almost militaristic display. If you're 15 years old and you dream of design, you dream of a better world, you're being shown a locked door. You're being shown a gate you are very much, it's clear that like you do not participate in these dialogues. They're secret. They're opaque to you. And the system of like even like social graces and capital you have to pass through to access what you would love to know, what you'd love to see. What's it like to make something better? What's a conversation look like that leads to results? I think it's been 40, 50 years of culture building walls around that. And what I really want to do, and I think it's just, I know it's a really simple thing, and it's like, when you say a system of values, but like literally to try and build a space that if I was 15 or if I was 12 or I was 13 and I was dreaming about design and I was like, I want to go visit that space. I want to be in those conversations. And then whether or not you make it to our space or whether you make one of your own and whether you make one with your friends or like, because the other thing, and I said this in my Straka talk, the goal of Terrain is not to scale and become the next great design
which
studio.
I love.
The goal of Terrain is just to be an example of a model of production that ideally any creative person should feel that they are entitled to find their equivalent of that model for themselves.
Totally. And like thinking about this 12 or 13-year-old kid, like it's very plausible that the first piece of graphic design that they fall in love with is an album cover. And so, I mean, I would love to hear from you. You've done some of these. Does the state of the album art really change? And one thing we were thinking about going into this was like Charli XCX going back and like retroactively, streamlining all of her album art on these streaming services to match the aesthetic of Brat, and rather than whatever her original design language was for that album. So I don't know. What do you think about album art as a sort of, gateway into graphic design for an aspiring young designer?
I think it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that, like, I mean, I love album art. I've said publicly that my route into design was like kind of through
New Order
design objects that really spoke to me, with some of these like physical records of Peter Savile's designs for New Order.
Oh, so good.
Growing up, like kind of getting the best of and the rest of New Order for like my 8th birthday or something, and kind of like only having those 2 CDs in my collection. So for months at a time in my bedroom, just sitting on the floor, listening to those records and listening to them on a CD player that has no visual, no screen, and so then just having to look at the record, read every word in the liner note, even though I don't know what some of these words mean or whatever, like in this mystical language. Just look at everything there. There's no question that world does not exist anymore. And if you make an album artwork, you are, I think the gesture of Charli erasing her discography and then rebuilding it in the image of Brat is the like perfect like Sisyphean sadness of like what design is fated to be in a lot of situations now, where it's just like this constantly self-destroying recycled surface of the now that is in a losing game against technology. When we make
is it because it's mimetic? Like, is that recycled now, tied to the communication via
Spotify like kind of sets the agenda.
Yeah.
And so because it's free, right? Like it's a digital file, so there's no cost of production. She didn't have to republish her discography. They just updated the PNGs. Right?
So it's too easy to overwrite.
Well, this is going to like another thing I took from your talk was like the idea of like ultra reality in cinema and like the camera moving around. Like you are the camera, you are the main character. Like this feels very tied to that for me. Like a quote I wrote down was when you were talking about this is infinity is the digital property that we can't keep up with. Which what you're saying here is like it's free. There's no limit to reproducing it.
Yeah, I think a lot of my work, but a lot of the things that have preoccupied me for a long time, in the Strelka talk, or when I talked, I guess, with Matt and Holly about these ideas that I refer to as primacy, are about, I think, from my position as someone who entered cultural production from originally the perspective of like art history and looking at how visual culture both shapes and is shaped by the technological, political, social reality with which it engages. It felt, we were kind of, it's the cosmic joke. Everyone, I guess, is born at an interesting time for some reason, but like of our age, is that I believe like a fundamental new permanent default exists within what images are, how we access them, how we create meaning from them, how we create value from them. That has emerged in our lifetime, or in the kind of like, in the time frame of most of our lives, most people who are living now. And this is the fundamental basis of that shift, is that the new permanent default is that the capital, the meaning, the propagation is virtual, not physical. And that all of the value that we tied to physical systems of image propagation and image production doesn't really exist anymore. But we carry up, we like kind of, I have this image that I return to. I don't think I talked about it in the Struggle Talk, but I always talk, like I'm preoccupied by this image in my mind. I don't know if it's from a specific source, or whether it's just this thing which I've like kind of, like I keep coming back to, but of a figure, maybe that, you know, like maybe it's from an old Japanese movie or something, a samurai movie, but it happens a lot in samurai movies where the character is given the killing blow. They're like run through with a sword, and they kind of fight on for a little while after they know that they're before they know that they're dead, kind of thing. But they're gone. Like there's this dance, like dance macabre, or whatever, where like that is performed after the killing blow. And I think so much of what we are surrounded by in our lives, magazine publishing, like kind of even like the way in which like kind of certain types of like high fashion or the cultural symbols and signifiers that are associated with it, music publishing, and we're in this dance macabre where it's like they're dead, but everyone agrees to pretend that they're not dead yet.
I feel the same way, David. Yeah. I mean, I always use the dead star analogy where it's like we're receiving light from a star that's already died. But I also think, you know, I've heard for the things, I think a lot of people actually know that they're already dead, but there are people who believe that you can succeed. And this goes back to Francis and I started off before you came on, referencing again that, like, you know, New York Magazine State of the Media, talking to people who I think are participating in methods of media that are light from an already dead star, or they are the tactical moves of, you know, tactical last moves of a samurai that's already been run through with a sword. I've heard it described as like fracking. I think there's a lot of people who are already in these positions of institutional power. They know that it's dead, but it doesn't really benefit them to start over, try to steer the ship that's too big, or ask what's next. So they turn to fracking, which is just squeezing the remaining value out of what used to sort of work and hope for the best, you know, limping along on, you know, Google Ads revenue or whatever. And it takes people who really have nothing to lose, who are establishing new publication studio practices, methodologies that sort of acknowledge, okay, digital primacy has already been achieved. What now? How do I account for that? To bring these fresh ideas in, but they're doing it without institutional support, because the institutional support is still going to the frackers.
Well, I think one of the ways that culture works, one of the constants, and one of the, you know, I've talked about before on my Twitter, these like nostalgia loops that are like, actually it's really easily calculable. You just look at what was popular 20 years ago for 5-year-olds, and now that those 5-year-olds are 25 and they have disposable income, that desire is going to be being sold back to them. The latent unresolved desire from their childhood, the things that they couldn't buy, and now it's going to be sold back to them, kind of thing. And similarly as well, I think like, it's when I say that these things are dead, what I don't mean is like no one is ever going to listen to or buy music again, or it won't be an enormously popular part of our lives, but rather some of the ways in which, for example, like the album cover is perceived as important is because there are people that are alive who remember the album cover being important, and they perform almost without thinking a veneration or like a kind of a respect, or they look to the album cover to give them certain information about the record, or what was the artist thinking, what were they trying to express with this, because they learned as a, you know, when they were young, or, you know, like kind of in the passion of their like highest level of engagement with this medium, that these were texts that were rich in value, rich in knowledge, rich in importance. And now if you go and load up an old Charlie album on Spotify and it has the Brat cover, if you day one come to that and that's the first time you listen to that record and you look at it, like, those people are being taught something different. They're being taught that these are not permanent markers of value. They don't represent artistic statements around career. They are points of data in a commercial campaign. They express at any given moment what the like macro position of that artist is relative to a market. And those people would be entitled to correct maybe in paying less attention to these things, seeing them as less valuable, seeing them as less credible, important components of an artistic statement. That generation, the generation, like I said, who are 12 or 13 now, by the time they're 30, I don't think they'll have the nostalgia for album covers that we do. Talk about Peter Saville and all these things. In that, what these things are to them is justifiably less meaningful, justifiably less important. because it does not contain these. It isn't like a useful historical document. And it's like Kanye being able to release a record and then unfinished and add tracks 2 days later and remaster it. This isn't like a triumph of technology. This is just the end of the idea of releasing a record. This is just the end of the artistic achievement of what it meant to release an album, because you had to that was it. When Prince completes
the end of that limitation.
That's it. And for all of your strengths and for all of the weaknesses, you live by that statement, and that's the risk and that's the skill, etc. And it's like, I think there are a lot of things where it's like the invisible effect is someone like, but if there was a mistake on the album, you could fix it. Why wouldn't you fix it? And it's like, it's not that fixing it is a problem. It's that the meaning of the unfixed album changes forever. Like the meaning of what it means to try and make an album that doesn't require fixing changes forever. And I don't want to be a pessimist about human ambition, but usually when we make it so that there's no reward or value in an achievement, people don't pursue it anymore.
So are we all going to use AI to create our own fonts? Like, can I just wake up and be like, I'm sending all my emails in Daisy font today?
You can, but this is I think the kind of gray goo culture problem, right? Where it's like again, one of the reasons why when we have this conversation and I say New Order and you go, oh, Peter Saville, and I see the emotional reaction you have and we make a connection, is because a shared symbol exists in the midst, in the space, in the cultural mien, in our milieu, that was there, that created shared meaning, that created shared focus, and that also therefore becomes a cipher, becomes useful in this conversation. We used it to make a point. We used it to explore ideas. And if everything is the equivalent of Daisy font, not that Daisy font wouldn't be valuable, but that we're absolutely at the point where, for example, everyone's version of the record on their Spotify could have a cover that was unique.
like Netflix thumbnails that are generated for the
generated for the user, and could even go beyond that. Could even kind of actually add artistic agencies that know that this person kind of likes a manga style, so it's pushing it even in that direction, kind of thing.
Something I want to get into on this. So it's kind of, I read this tweet from Scott Belsky right after listening to your Strelka talk, and you're talking about your idea of narrative, which is, I was seeing it kind of as this Gesamtkunstwerk idea of all the context, putting when you're making a book, you should be thinking about the paper and the publisher and every aspect of it. But then, so reading this Scott Belsky tweet right after, which is ultimately just marketing for Adobe, but I think also a relatively compelling idea. He was talking about how the creator economy becomes the meaning economy, what's the quote? He defines meaning here as the story.
He's just saying that because I already used taste economy, and so he can't use it.
But so the story, the purpose, the myths behind the creators themselves, and the brand value. But yeah, it's marketing for this idea, this this content credentials metadata idea that I think they're developing with a few other big companies, so you can put the provenance of an image in metadata on an image.
I mean, whatever, man.
Well, okay, I want to be clear. I think this position that I'm going to justify kind of very directly, or kind of put my own position out there, on what I don't want to use the word role objectively as a graphic designer, because it's clear this is not their role in culture, and it's also clear that this is not but what I think design could be, what design ought be, how these ideas of narrative, for example, inform my practice, is that it really is a kind of ultimate endorsement of a kind of a quantum death of the author, which is your narratives, the ones which are unique to you, which are informed by all of your experience. So my unique experience of being, of listening to these New Order records and what they mean to me is impossible, untranslatable, uncommunicable. That does not leave you. It is there within you. What leaves you are the signs, sigils, gestures, language, images, symbols that you can marshal, that you can assemble to create visual systems, to create codes, to create images, etc., that you can put in front of other people that can trigger and activate their narratives. And the path of the sensitive life of a designer is, I think, the one of starting to become attuned to and interested in the narratives of other people, what things may exist that have cultural visibility that might therefore become useful in communicating sentiment statements, what actions one can take to change existing things or to cause a viewer to question them or to flag certain things as important, to change their hierarchies of value. And it's the exact opposite of the Adobe dream of that now you can make work that's like hyper specific to your tastes. And it's like, if anything, not only is that a disaster, like de facto in terms of a communication strategy, but it's also teaching you not to listen to the only things which are important, which is like a sensitivity to how the moments where your taste was A, what was it informed by? And B, what might you be able to do with this that might have impact or meaning for other viewers, for other people?
Absolutely. Like, and it's also like basically saying that the experience of these things isn't already completely customized when it is custom, because if it wasn't custom, it would be communicable. And like you and I can stand next to Guernica, but I don't know what's inside your head, your experience of the painting. And even somebody who would measure your brainwaves doesn't know what your experience of the painting is, which comes out of like, like I've read a bunch of books on neuroaesthetics, don't ask me why. And like, we still don't know. Like you and I standing next to Guernica, your experience is completely private. My experience is completely private, even as we're talking about it. Same thing with listening to a song, same thing with reading a book. And so it's kind of teaching a generation of kids, like, reading a book isn't worth it or watching a movie isn't worth it. Because that experience could be more custom for you if you do it in such and such a way, when actually it already is completely customized. And the value add that you could create through digital primacy doesn't need to be around customization. It could be around something else like creativity, creation, trying to communicate your custom experience of that art.
I mean, you can do an experiment internally of imagining different scales of culture exposure. Because what's being invented here, I think, is the possibility of like total solipsism, total cultural solipsism, like the idea of the person
as the ideal.
The person who lives, like kind of with the goggles on or whatever, the Apple Vision Pro, and everything they see is being generated uniquely for them. It is never seen by anyone else. It is entirely a product of, some synthetic read of their desires, whatever. And let's go like philosophically. Let's be like, and let's say the system's perfect. Let's say this generates for them every day the best movie they've ever seen, like the most compelling content. With the most brilliant characters and stories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's take Adobe at their word. Let's say, you crack this technology and that it produces perfect dreams. Okay, that person has to follow the experiment. If they ever take the goggles off and they go and meet another human being. I've kind of had this experience all my life growing up when hearing other people talk about their trips, when people talk about doing drugs. I think there's nothing more boring in the world than
hearing somebody describe an acid trip.
Oh, it's like telling someone about a dream that you had.
Yeah.
Which I actually love. I find them so interesting, but that's...
Well, specifically, I think you've had... So let's say they describe the perfect movie to somebody else.
Yeah.
The whole thing is it's completely useless. For them to describe it in perfect detail would take as long as the movie itself.
Right. It's like, you haven't seen the movie that this woman that looks exactly like Daisy gets everything that she wants? Well, we have nothing to talk about.
Let's say it's like tomorrow you go in a room and they put goggles on you and you watch the best movie you've ever seen in your life. It's the new Christopher Nolan movie or whatever. It's incredible. And you're like, you want to go and tell your friends, kind of see this movie. But obviously, A, they can't. They never will. They never can. Their software will create their version of their movie with characters that are attuned to them. B, I think you'll immediately be exhausted by the idea of having that. It's very, very simple. There's been words for this throughout human history since the dawn of time, and this is just a perfect description of madness. This is when you have a material world that you cannot communicate to other people. You're possessed by visions, you hear voices, whatever, that only you hear, only you see. And I can't think of anything more obviously of zero value than giving everyone in the world the ability to either see, but only for themselves, perfect media, or B, create flawlessly the media that they believe is perfect. Like that
I think if you want to do that, you should at least have to sell your winery, right? Like, I think that's a fair price to pay for that level of solipsism, because basically, like, I think I said I want to talk about Megalopolis with you because I saw you tweet about it. Like, basically, like, if everyone, and J-Lo's movie is like kind of the same way. It's like, this is basically if everyone had access to the resources to create a movie that's like custom to them, we would get stuff like J-Lo's thing, like Megalopolis, which is basically Francis Ford Coppola saying, this is the movie, I'm making the movie that I want to see.
Don't need any external input. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I am the creator and I am the audience. And you're just there.
I mean, okay, so there's like a gerontocratic joke, right, about the idea that like maybe in our society everyone can make the movie that you want, but it's like it says that the sick bargain is that you have to wait until you're rich enough to make that movie, and you won't be rich until you're completely senile and you're totally exhausted of all of your creative spirit and will, because the only way you made the money was by making 15 other compromised movies that had to be a success, and only those people get there. Did you like Megalopolis? What were your thoughts on it? Like, did you?
I mean, like is such I don't know that I would use the word like. I didn't walk out. I was entertained. I've even thought about it since seeing it. I don't know how much of it I'll remember in 2 weeks. And
I mean, okay.
Yeah.
I guess you'll know this because you will have seen my struggle talk. I really love cinema. I think that for exactly the reasons that we've talked about in this conversation so far, the idea of millions of people sitting down and having exactly the same hallucination that they can leave the theater and talk about to one another afterwards, that they can use to explore cultural ideas, to tell stories. We can quote specific lines like poetry. We give characters names. This is a mythic component of our society that I believe is of enormous value, and that in a world that deprives people of shared signs and symbols with which to make sense of their lives in the universe, popular cinema is something that I think is unquestionably one of the parts of the modern project that I think is super interesting. It's very close to, like, it's our oral culture. It's our myths of Olympus. It is the space. And at various points in my life, like I've found the movies that are actually being released in the cinema to be more or less interesting from this perspective. When I was doing the struggle talk, I was finding them particularly interesting because it seemed that there was this emergent trope that felt very much like the front edge of a wave that was impacting society, and that it was happening in cinema first. That somehow storytelling was responding to the virtual, or this like kind of presence of new virtual defaults in cinema in a way that other parts of culture were yet to catch up to or react to.
What were the examples that you were picking up on for that?
So I in the struggle talk, I kind of named the trope, the cluster of tropes, this like kind of mode of storytelling that I called ultra reality. And the first movie that really blew my mind, that I was like, I'm watching a new medium here when I saw it, was the first Avengers film, which was the first film I'd ever seen that, and I'm not going to credit the filmmakers as doing this deliberately, but because of the story that they had to tell, I think they almost accidentally fell into this space where for the first time they were free to tell the story in the way the story kind of suggested it should be told. And it was, in terms of the filmmaking tropes, I think I listed 5 in the struggle talk, and I'm not sure I'm going to remember them like perfectly off the top of my head, but that they are certain collapses of convention of how a story is normally structured that all these films had in common. And one was that that they were stopping using kind of even cuts in the movie. You'd get these very long, like oneers became a thing around this time as well. These like very long, like seemingly unbroken or edited.
Yeah, wasn't Birdman a single shot?
Oh yeah.
So Bird, like after I do the talk, like a few movies like cross the Rubicon and go completely cutless. So like 1917, I think, or like what Quiet on the Western Front recently does this. Birdman does this, but like basically, but the idea behind that is that like. In a very simple way, previously, all forms of narrative storytelling, because of the technological medium of their transmission, text, were iterative and saccaded. You had pages that you turned, you had a sequence that you encountered things in, and then online you would also load between pages in this really like kind of cumbersome way. And technology was starting to suggest, and now I think we're really going there with spatial computing, the dream of the seamless experience, the uninterrupted experience, the endless scroll, where anytime that experience was interrupted, it was primitive, it was regressive, it was a hallmark of an earlier rudimentary technology that would in time come to be surpassed. And so the godlike move is the cutlass move, is the like single unbroken experience of being. And this also comes to the Apple's idea of spatial computing, where they're trying to create a seamless experience between computation, thought, and life. That this like, and that anything that distracts from that is something that they're like afraid of. They're like a sad ape that like does, you know, like kind of shamed by a cut or shamed by an interruption. So that's Cutlass. Then also the lack of the disinterest with or the shaming of regular time. So if like the cut is shamed in the first one, the movies that move almost entirely into slow motion or that demonstrate mastery over time. And so then after Stroke, you get things like Tenet and you get these movies where Interstellar, where the filmmaker's explicit proposal to the viewer is that the godlike power of filmmaking is the godlike power to triumph over time. Time can go backwards, time can slow down. We can like modulate your experience of time. And again, this is this like kind of like technological idea that I think like the internet and like even the cutting edge of like algorithmic trading, it's like obviously is preponderance in our society that we feel this like the last burden that we're trying to overcome right now is that we're slaves to time. And so like when you see things like the dechronologicalization of the social media feed, where things are ordered by narrative importance, not by when they happened. That previously everything was chronological, and then they invent these new modes where it's like actually it's about storytelling. It's about putting like kind of moving time around to fit the narrative you want to show.
This is like too. I'm thinking of like the concept of like the second brain that I see people like tweeting about, like tech types, where it's like, oh, you put all your thoughts into Notion or whatever, these systems of apps, so you can like automate your thoughts and like, you know, think faster to get to what faster, you know.
Again, a fear of linear time, and then like an obvious thing I can say is people like Brian Johnson, like this idea of like a morbid fear of aging, like which leads to this like you know it's very romantic. It's like Byronic and Shelleyan, where you enter into a phase of almost death in life, where you become like a prisoner of life, where you get up at 6 a.m. and have to take 70 supplements, and then you kind of like you can't see the sun, and you kind of become
because the primacy of death, right, is for most people the default primacy is life, and for somebody who's trying to prolong their life, ironically, the primacy becomes death. And as you were speaking about disrupted time, actually, like what popped into my head was like Mark Fisher's essay about Inception. But I was like, I pulled it up in another window because I was like, what did he say? And he said, in Inception, as in late capitalist culture in general, you're always in someone else's dream, which is also the dream of no one.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I love Mark, but what still like an enormous loss for all of us, because for all of these things, both I would have loved to have continued to see Mark's reactions, responses to them, and also I completely understand that it was their choice that they did not want to continue doing that. But I'm getting back to Megalopolis. I promise you, this is one of my enormous crescent tangents.
I trust the journey
outside of the ballpark. With the movies I was talking about in Struggle, because obviously Megalopolis hadn't come out yet, and you know, like kind of, some of these things were proposals for things that were going to happen, and the other ones just really, really quickly, like freedom of movement. Like the camera no longer represents the plausible perspective of a human observer, so most of the vantage points in traditional cinema were essentially modeling the camera to represent for the viewer a human
eye level, like
so at eye level in a dialogue scene, or kind of like looking down from a vantage point or something. And this movement, not just to like kind of the perspective of some kind of omnipotent godlike observer, where not only can the camera fly and move, but it takes thrill and delight in showcasing its own like kind of independent like navigation of the space. It would pass through tiny cracks, like in what's the Enter the Void, like kind of like do a lot of these keyhole shots and stuff. But in these Marvel movies, this is the thing, like the Avengers is not an art house movie. It is not considered
unlimited budget, like
right. It's not viewed normally in film criticism as the act of someone who wants to make a statement about the truly groundbreaking idea of what film can be. But that's honestly like kind of the first time I saw it in the cinema, I was like shocked. I felt like it was demonstrating these tropes again, that completely naively, in a way where it had abandoned like 90% of what cinema was. But I'll just very, very quickly run through the last like kind of bits
go ahead.
Like, where this goes, because the first thing about that film, which was like just like shocking, stunning, is it's a Götterdämmerung myth. It takes place on Olympus. It is a story about gods, and these gods are bored, and it is not a story about people. And again, we come back to the idea of like kind of death in life. It's like these are characters who can't die. I mean, we're now like 15 years right into like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, realizing they've got a problem because they can't die. Like they can't. It won't die. We're bored of life. Like we're bored of it. And these characters in the first Avengers, they're already bored of being gods. And none of them are interested in humans. And for the first time ever, it was a film about the Earth where humans were completely irrelevant. There's basically no humans in the movie. They kind of basically don't have dialogue. There's only one real human character. There's the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I can't remember their name, Agent Coulson or whatever.
Yeah.
And
Nick Fury, right?
Like Colby Smulders, who like they live on their sky barge. They literally live on an invisible. They live in the cloud, like kind of. They live in this invisible network of control that hovers above us, right? So you know, like kind of this like cloud metaphor where they live. But they're the last humans, and they're basically the system administrators of the God machine. And Nick Fury, God bless him, is the closest thing to a protagonist of this movie. Samuel L. Jackson is assembling the Avengers, but what that means is he's kind of going up and door knocking these gods and kind of just saying to them, "You have nothing to live for. Mm-hmm. Why don't you just do what we want you to do? Like you're basically like a kind of like a mindless entity. Why don't you just like kind of?" And they all rage against it in different ways, but they invariably come round to his point of view and team up and fight this alien invasion that destroys Manhattan and kills millions of people, but no one cares because people don't matter in this universe. We're interested in like the dynamics of the gods, and I am getting to Megalopolis. I promise you, this is like a very long-winded way of getting to this. But Fury's character, what makes him the one human who can talk to the gods, is very funny. Like the movie was during this period where it was still like Hollywood was very interested in 3D. Mm-hmm. And the Avengers was released in IMAX 3D, and it was this period where 3D was really, really, really important, just for those couple of years where they were really trying to push 3D. And I always thought it was really, really funny that like the Hulk is big and green and infinitely strong. Captain America is like incredibly brave and like has perfect martial prowess. Tony Stark's the smartest man who ever lived. He can invent anything. And what's Nick Fury's superpower? That he can control the gods. What's his like? What makes him the one person who can like kind of walk between the worlds? How is he Blade, who's both like a vampire and a human? Mm-hmm. What's his thing? And the funny thing is like Nick Fury only has one distinguishing feature as like as a superhero, and it's that he only has one eye. That's his like only distinguishing feature. But it's just really funny that means that like his superpower is he doesn't have binocular vision. He's the only one who can't watch the movie. And that's the
he's
thing.
He's immune to IMAX. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's pretty notable. Well, I'm going to force you back to Megalopolis by telling you what I did think was interesting about it, which is I've always been interested in, not always, but since I found out what Super Studio was and first started encountering their work, I've been totally enamored with the aesthetics of it. And my Twitter cover photo is a Super Studio photo. Interested in this idea of post architecture, and, interested that the kind of the protagonist of Megalopolis, he's a architect, urban planner, whatever you want to call it. I think Francis Ford Coppola is approaching this more in a like Roman Empire sense. I don't think he's thought deeply about post architecture in the same way maybe you and I have, or like Super Studio would represent it. But there were images that I took from that film that felt like Super Studio images to me, and for that reason will probably stick with me. But I think he's trying to make a statement, like an old man's statement about civilization through architecture. And that statement's not that interesting. But thinking about post architecture is interesting to me, even if that's not the message that he intended.
I struggled in Megalopolis to see a coherent idea about architecture. I thought that the architecture in the film was hilarious. It was very comical in that he constructed, firstly, he constructed an idea of a city called New Rome, which, a very labored metaphor of New York. And then by the end of the movie, he seemed to have even forgotten that he was setting the movie in New Rome. And they had things like the Elvis impersonator singing God Bless America and stuff, and the American flag, where he like lost control of the metaphor that he was even establishing. And it was just America, and it was just New York. And then you had the like truly like comically pathetic Neri Oxman, Arc Viz, just like preset 2004 Arc Greeble of, just like kind of biokinetic sculpture and like kind of these like parametric forms, it was so like post-it note, like architecture goes here,
totally
architecture goes here kind of thing.
Like Zaha Hadid in the metaverse, and like that meme that's like civilization if, like the city he ends up constructing basically just looks like that meme. But there are moments, there's the moments like the building collapse where I'm like, oh, that is actually a cool image. It's like the ocean rushing over the skyline in that super studio image. But I honestly think he did it accidentally because I also don't think he was in control of the metaphor.
I'm sorry, guys, because I know there are a lot of things you want to talk about, and this is
going to be probably the last thing that we talk about.
Yeah, I've hewn very close to.
We could keep going, but I don't want to make our producer work too hard on the edit.
Megalopolis was in the same way that The Avengers was a really important movie for me, and I felt like I was seeing something new there, and I kind of like talked about ultra reality and these tropes, which again, like I haven't really explained in much detail here. But if you are interested in any of those ideas, they're in the Struggle Talk. If someone's listening and wants to engage with them, but
we could put it in the show notes too.
Definitely.
The first time I saw a movie in the last few years that felt like I was having a similar experience where I was like, oh my God, I'm seeing something new kind of storytelling, happened during Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. And it happened again during Megalopolis, where it felt like an affirmation of what Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny was starting to do. My principal criticism of Megalopolis is a movie, which I think is in many ways like a kind of a disastrous folly, but that it really should have come out 6 months ago. It needed to come out whilst Joe Biden was still president, because it represents a moment, I think, of crisis in storytelling.
Well, Joe Biden is still president.
A failing vision. Well, he was still running.
True. He technically is still president.
Yeah.
Just
he was still leading a narrative.
Let the record show.
The record show that, like, at the time, it's true, he is still president, but rather this idea, like, when he was still doggedly insisting, I think, that what he represented was what also the vision that mankind should follow. And this Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, if you haven't seen this film, if anyone's listening to this, like, kind of, I'd say that this is a film that I think is a really interesting product of our time, because it tells a new myth, like it adds a new myth that I think Megalopolis is the second movie that attempts to tell this myth. And it's a myth of a protagonist who longs to die and is not allowed by the universe, by the film, by the other characters in the film, and by the filmmakers to die. So they basically play themselves to this stalemate. It's like both of these movies have like kind of stalemate endings where the characters kind of realize that not only are they kind of going to drop their conflict, but that their conflict is irrelevant, that like if one of them winning wouldn't be a win kind of thing. Indy is in Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny. He's like impossibly old. It's Harrison Ford. He's like 80. Everyone watches this movie and you watch every scene and you're like, Jesus, like kind of like what were they injecting him with in the trailer to like kind of like get him out of bed and do this stuff? And it's like, this looks painful and he looks in pain and he doesn't want to be doing this anymore. But commerce and our society required another Indiana Jones film, and Harrison Ford might die soon, so they're like, we got to get one more out of you. And he's clearly like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. And in the film, Indiana Jones is like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to stop. I want to die. I want to not live anymore. And the crazy thing about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is it's a film. I've never seen this in Western art before. I think that there are non-Western narratives that have very similar themes, but I've never seen the protagonist asked to die. And the film world and the medium around it say no. In Western art, if the protagonist asks to die, they do it, and they do it heroically. Like kind of
in Eastern art.
Yeah.
No, in Western art, in like Armageddon.
Okay.
Well, this is going back to like the
like you go on living. I'm like kind of it's time for me to like I've got to go manually set the bomb.
I see.
That's heroic there.
Okay.
This is kind of going back to the samurai thing you were talking about at the beginning, but like where that in that one, like the samurai doesn't die for a little while and then suddenly does.
In the West, the
ego
is so powerful and so sacrosanct that like if the hero wants to die, they will die. Mm-hmm. If the hero wants to win, they will win. In Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Indy does not want to be alive anymore. And he is required to be alive for the film to exist and make money. So he's forced to be alive for the duration of the film. And he kind of enters this state of like existential nothingness. They send him back in time to the ancient Greeks and stuff again, this timey-wimey thing, like kind of like, again, like reality trope. He gets sent back and to retrieve the Dial of Destiny from Archimedes or whatever, and is sent forward into the present. And like some kind of, the film ends with this just like, again, this insane gesture, which is the way that Megalopolis ends, where like some fucking panda in a zoo, he's trapped in his apartment. They've put him back in Indy's apartment, and he's literally there, like kind of, you can sense how meaningless and painful life is for him, that he has no reason to be. And they just magic Kate Capshaw into the scene, like his love interest from like previously. She's old, he's old now. And it's basically this thing where it's just like, so go on, like, again, these like two pandas, like, go do this.
I'm going to say something potentially controversial. Isn't this like every war since World War II? You can't pull out and you can't win. Is this the like film equivalent?
Well, as the American Forever War, like the Forever franchise, like the characters who won't die.
Yeah.
I mean, I really would recommend. Like this movie opens with, in a fantasy. Basically, the reason why, again, these two movies I feel are married, or like kind of like forms of the same vision, is like the movie opens with like a ticker tape parade for the moon landing in New York, and Indiana Jones is there, and Shia LaBeouf is wearing a Rebel Without a Cause leather jacket and riding a motorcycle, and the Nazis are there for some reason, and it's just like. And it's like, you might as well have had Joe Biden in his green Corvette eating an ice cream coming down the street, because it's just like, this is what it looks like when every neuron in a boomer's brain fires at the same time. And it's the same thing, like kind of when you're watching Megalopolis, and like Coppola's 80 and he's like, I'm going to die. But no, I've got something really important to say. And it's like Elvis is singing America the Beautiful, and we're hanging a property developer like Mussolini, and we're building a magical thing in Central Park, and the mayor is making peace with this brilliant architect, and he's promising him new life because we put a baby on a fucking magic carpet in Times Square. And it's really just total incoherent nonsense. It's absolute garbage, but it's the kind of garbage that could only come from a mind that has like lived unsatisfyingly without resolution through the 20th century, like kind of the end state of a boomer. And it's like, isn't there like kind of like some happy ending at the end of this rainbow? I got a whole life of happy endings. I'm 80 years old now. I'm 85 years old now. I'm Indiana Jones and I'm 82. Isn't there some way this ends? And both these films have no plausible resolution.
Yeah. They're like singing Bohemian Rhapsody at karaoke. This is what it is. It's the equivalent of singing Bohemian Rhapsody at karaoke and or the Vietnam War. Pick your metaphor.
There's also, so this is reminding me the latest Now Scarred trilogy. The third one just came out. It's Morning Star.
I'm actually surprised we made it this far with this group of people without mentioning Now Scarred.
Well, so I've read the first two books. The third one just came out. I'm planning to buy it in the next couple of weeks. But kind of the premise, it's like kind of set in a similar world to my struggle books, where it's like Norway, and like, you know, could be cut from like his childhood,
autofiction.
Whatever. But it's more of like a science fiction thing. And like the science fiction aspect is this new star has risen in the sky, and suddenly nobody can die. Like one of the main characters in the second one is like this funeral director, and he's like on vacation And that's a whole nother thing. But anyways, he's like calling his guys back home at the funeral parlor. They're like, yeah, nobody's been coming in for like the last 6 days or whatever. So I don't know, the like end of this, it's a trilogy. So the latest book just came out. I'm excited to read it, but I feel like this is kind of getting in on the same zeitgeist myth that you're talking about.
Well, I think like death, I've thought about this a lot in terms of having to make sense of some aspects of both my practice and my relation to design. I think one of the things which I'm really interested in, because of the finality of all the beauty in the world exists in these things which exist inside people's minds, and then they die.
Yeah.
And that's an inescapable and irretrievable like Rubicon that never is crossed. And that when you make a work, or when you make art, or when art affects you, it enters this place from where there's no return, and that ultimately you have a finite amount of time for that thing to have meaning or to
beauty is ephemeral,
and then it's gone. And one of the things which I think is there is clearly a preoccupation of fear that is, I think our society is becoming now like kind of overburdened with. That increasingly this is becoming like an unresolvable space where, as I think capital, as value exploitation, as every metric of everything in our lives becomes about trying to capture value, to build
and scale it.
And to turn these things into concrete things, that death is becoming this problem that no one, like, it's becoming like more and more and more the like kind of the black hole that's going to consume this universe.
Yeah, the last frontier.
And it's no, but I think like capital's fear of death is a new thing. Like kind of, we've always been afraid of death. Religion has reckoned with the fear of death. You know, society has had these things, but I think the idea of like in late capitalism specifically, in when.
Well, this is why all the billionaires are making like doing the space race, right? It's the fear of the death of the earth and like trying to get away from that type of thing.
I don't know. I think that the thing is like, I think this is a conversation for another time, and it's like kind of weird.
We'll have to do a part 2, just a death focused episode.
I actually think that one of the things which, you know, I've talked about recently on a couple of just informally in the studio through like kind of the practice of it is, I worked on something, I can't say what it is, but I worked on it for a few years. It will probably never come out. But I was finding it the most rewarding or interesting thing that I'd worked on. It's an identity for something that I think, you know, there's a very good chance it will never launch. But I realized that the reason I was finding it so liberating is because it was breaking a taboo that was like ever present in design language. And that was for the first time I was working on something that felt like it was both aware of and comfortable with the idea of death, and could acknowledge this in the design system, and that death played a role in how the viewer was engaged, and that this wasn't the threat of death or, you know, like some kind of like military system or something, but it was actually, you know, it was a product that framed death as part of life. And I really think that it is, I think part of why my early work or some of my practice, like kind of like even with like the black background and like the calling
Tombs.
my site boy Doom series, like this space of, with which I engage, that maybe certain audiences, why they might find it compelling or why they might, is because it's just, there are vanishingly few spaces in our culture that explore notions of what might exist beyond life, or what is outside of life, or helps illuminate life by maybe by trying to depict or have you encounter its opposite or its absence. And I think that I'm very curious. I don't have like great answers as to why. Again, like, why do I have to go to a very private space and build my own working methodology in order to explore these things in my practice? Because they're very unwelcome in most conventional design systems. And more, I think that like we are becoming kind of like the collateral humans who just die in their millions in New York and under the like kind of in the footprints of the gods. I do feel like we're increasingly becoming like kind of collateral damage in the struggle between capital and death. Capital's vain, stupid, mindless attempts to somehow surpass or exceed death, or ignore it with a finality that makes it like, forever go away. And it's kind of like that, when a 5-year-old is first encounters mortality, maybe their childhood pet dies or whatever, and they try crying hard enough that they can, make it not true, or like kind of that throes of that first tantrum. I remember being told as a kid, like, that I would die, and that having that tantrum and just being like, no, I don't want to die. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel like we're having to suffer a little bit at the moment, the cultural milieu of we're kind of in the tantrum mode.
People like Elon Musk, they're throwing that tantrum, but they have like money to throw at the tantrum. Yeah. Like, not just money to throw at a shitty film, like the technology of the tantrum.
Takes a lot of money.
We have to wrap up.
I think, we will discover the death of this podcast episode right now.
But we'll resurrect next week.
No, this has been great. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David.
This has been Tasteland. Thank you.